In a colonnaded room, somewhere in the Roman Empire, in the early years of the 2nd century, a teacher named Hierocles takes a stylus and draws upon a wax tablet a small circle, and within that circle he writes a single word, self. Around it he draws another circle, and another, until the tablet is marked with a figure resembling the ripples a stone leaves upon still water, each ring labeled with a relation he expects his students to recognize. He sets down the stylus and tells them that the work of philosophy is not to add more circles to this figure, but to do something far stranger. He tells them the work is to draw the outer circles inward until they touch the center. We know almost nothing of the man who taught this. His name appears in a handful of ancient compilations, and what survives of his writing comes to us in fragments preserved by a later anthologist named Stobaeus, who copied passages he found useful into a kind of commonplace book for his son. From those fragments, we recover a teacher who lived under the emperors Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, who wrote an introductory handbook called The Elements of Ethics, and who composed a treatise on what the Greeks called Oikeiōsis. That single Greek word, untranslatable in any tidy way, is the subject of this lesson. And the figure of the circles, which Hierocles drew to make Oikeiōsis visible to his students, is the figure we shall sit with for the next half hour or so. You may begin then by hearing the word itself, Oikeiōsis. It is built from oikos, the Greek word for household, for home, for the dwelling that belongs to you and to which you belong. To make something oikeion is to make it your own, to recognize it as akin to you, to take it into the household of your concern. The verb form, oikeiostai, is what an infant does when it first reaches for its own foot and discovers that the foot is not a foreign object, but a part of the self. It is what a creature does when it appropriates its body, its breath, its existence as belonging to it. The Stoics, beginning with Zeno and Chrysippus, and developed through generations of teachers in the Porch and the schools that followed, made Oikeiōsis the foundation of their ethics. Before any virtue, before any precept, before any account of duty or right action, there is this primary fact. The living being recognizes itself as its own and acts to preserve what it recognizes. But the Stoics did not stop there. For if the infant first appropriates its body, the growing child appropriates its mother, its father, its siblings. The adult appropriates a spouse, a household, a city, and the philosopher, the Stoic claims, appropriates the whole of the rational community of human beings, and beyond that, the cosmos itself. Oikeiōsis is the name for the natural movement by which the circle of what you call your own expands outward through the course of a life. It is, in the Stoic account, not an artificial achievement imposed upon a selfish nature. It is what nature is doing in you if you do not obstruct it. Hierocles, in the fragment that survives, puts the matter this way. Each of us, he says, is as it were enclosed by many circles, some smaller and some larger, some encompassing and some encompassed, according to the different and unequal relations in which we stand to one another. The first and closest circle is the one which a man has drawn about his own mind as a center. In this circle is enclosed the body and whatever is taken up for the sake of the body. The next circle, more distant from the center and containing the first, is that within which we place our parents, brothers and sisters, wife and children. Outside of this, the third circle contains our uncles and aunts, our grandparents, the children of our brothers and sisters, and our cousins. The next circle includes the rest of our kin. Beyond this circle lies the circle of fellow demesmen. Beyond that, the circle of fellow tribesmen. Beyond that, the circle of fellow citizens. And so, by similar steps, the circle of those who dwell in neighboring towns, the circle of those of the same nation, and outermost and largest of all, the circle that encloses the whole human race. It is a quiet diagram. It does not flatter us. It tells us, without sentimentality, that we are creatures whose attention falls naturally upon what is near and slackens upon what is far. The figure is descriptive before it is prescriptive. Hierocles is not yet telling us what to do. He is telling us what we are. And then, having drawn the circles, he tells us the task. It is, he writes, the duty of a well-tempered man, in his proper treatment of each group, to contract the circles somehow toward the center, and to strive earnestly to transfer those from the enclosing circles into the enclosed. The cousin is to be treated, so far as possible, as the brother. The fellow citizen is to be treated, so far as possible, as the kinsman. The foreigner is to be treated, so far as possible, as the fellow citizen. The work of ethics, on this account, is the steady, lifelong labor of drawing the outer rings inward toward the center, until the warmth that belongs to those nearest is extended by deliberate effort to those who stand further off. This is the principle. We shall return to it. But first, we must say something of the man who drew it, and of the world in which he drew it. For the figure is more peculiar than it appears, and the world that received it was not a world disposed to find it easy. Of Hierocles himself, we have almost no biography. We know he was a Stoic of the 2nd century, working at a time when the school of the porch had become something less like a single institution and more like a tradition, dispersed across the empire, taught in private houses and rented halls and the porticos of provincial cities. Epictetus had recently died in Nicopolis. Marcus Aurelius was still a child, or perhaps not yet born, when Hierocles composed his Elements of Ethics. The great age of original Stoic system building, the age of Chrysippus, was 4 centuries past. What remained was the work of teaching, of transmission, of taking the inherited doctrines and rendering them into forms that ordinary educated Romans and Greeks could carry with them into their lives. Hierocles was, by all evidence, one of these teachers. The Elements was a handbook, an isagoge, an introduction. It was not meant for fellow philosophers. It was meant for the young man, perhaps 17 or 18, who had finished his grammar and his rhetoric and was now beginning the study of how to live. The treatise begins from the most basic observable fact about a living being, that it perceives itself and acts to maintain itself, and builds from this foundation toward the social duties, the relations of kinship and citizenship, and marriage and household. It is a patient book. It does not exhort, it explains. We may imagine the room, a house in a provincial city of the Eastern Empire, perhaps in Asia Minor, perhaps in Greece itself. The walls plastered, the floor tiled, a small group of students, 4 or 6 or 8, seated on benches or on cushions on the floor, a wax tablet, a stylus, a few rolls of papyrus on a small table. The teacher does not lecture from a height. He sits with them. He answers questions. He draws diagrams. He repeats what they have not understood. The pedagogy of the late Stoa was an intimate pedagogy, conducted at the scale of a household and at the pace of patient repetition. Outside the room, the empire. Trajan had recently extended its borders to their greatest extent, and Hadrian, succeeding him, had begun the long work of consolidating what had been seized. The roads were full of soldiers, merchants, slaves being transported from one province to another, embassies traveling to and from the capital. A man in Ephesus or Smyrna or Athens lived within a system of concentric loyalties as real and as palpable as the circles on Hierocles' tablet. He was the son of his father. He was the member of a particular phratry, a particular tribe. He was a citizen of his city, jealously proud of its history and its privileges. He was the subject of a distant emperor whose face he knew only from coins. And beyond all of these, he was a human being, sharing the species with the Parthian on the eastern frontier, with the Briton in the misty northwest, with the Ethiopian in the south. These were not abstractions. The slave market in any major city of the empire brought before the eyes of an ordinary citizen the human reality of the outer circles. The man being sold had been someone's son, someone's brother, someone's neighbor. He had stood in a circle of relations as dense and as warm as the one in which the buyer stood. The Stoic doctrine of the kinship of all human beings, the cosmopolitan claim that the wise man is a citizen of the world, was developed in full view of these markets, and the developers of the doctrine did not, for the most part, abolish the markets. This is a matter we shall return to. Hierocles, like Epictetus before him and Marcus after, taught within a society built upon slavery, and the figure of the circles must be read with that fact present in the room. We do not know whether Hierocles owned slaves. We do not know whether he traveled. We do not know whom he married, or whether he married, though he wrote at length on marriage and considered it a fundamental duty of the philosopher to enter the household state. We do not know what he looked like, or how old he was when he died, or where he was buried. The fragments give us a voice, careful and orderly and somewhat dry, and from that voice we must reconstruct a life. What we can say is this: the teacher who composed the figure of the circles was a man for whom philosophy was, before anything else, a practical art. He was not building a system to rival the systems of the ancients. He was taking what the ancients had built and rendering it useful. The figure of the circles is above all useful. A student who has seen it once does not forget it. A student who has been asked to identify for himself the circles in which he stands, and to ask of each circle whether he treats it as the doctrine demands, possesses a tool he will carry for the rest of his life. This is what Hierocles offered. This is what survives of him. Let us now look more closely at how the principle would have functioned, both in Hierocles' own teaching and in the lives of those he taught. For the figure of the circles is not merely a description of the social world. It is an instrument of self-examination, and the work it asks of the student is harder than it first appears. Consider the second circle, the circle of parents and siblings, spouse and children. Hierocles devotes substantial portions of his other writings to the duties owed within this circle. He has a treatise on marriage. He has a treatise on the household. He has a treatise on the conduct due to parents, in which he writes that we owe our parents a debt that can never be repaid, that they have given us the very substance of our being, and that the smallest service we can render them is to remember every day that we exist because they chose to give us existence. The fragment, preserved by Stobaeus, is unsparing. The man who neglects his parents, Hierocles writes, has forgotten the most elementary fact about himself. This is the inner work of the second circle. It is not enough to perform the outward duties of filial piety. The Stoic asks that you do the duties having understood why they are owed, that you do them not out of habit, not out of fear of public disapproval, not out of some calculation of inheritance, but because the recognition of what your parents are to you has become a settled part of your understanding. The circle is to be drawn inward by being filled with attention. But notice that the inward drawing of the second circle is, in a sense, the easiest. The relations of the household are already warm. The work there is the work of refining and sustaining a warmth that nature has provided. The harder work begins as we move outward. The third circle, the circle of extended kin, and the fourth, the circle of fellow demesmen and fellow citizens. These are the circles in which most of the conflicts of ordinary life take place. A man quarrels with his uncle over an inheritance. He distrusts his cousin for some old slight. He votes against his neighbor in the assembly. He treats the man 2 streets over as a stranger because he has never had occasion to do otherwise. Hierocles is uninterested in the moral dramas of the inner circle because nature already supplies the motive there. He is interested in the cooler regions where motive must be supplied by reason. What does it mean to draw the cousin inward toward the brother? It means, Hierocles would say, to begin by addressing him as one would address a brother. The language we use shapes the relations we maintain. To call a man cousin is already to hold him at a measured distance. To call him brother is to invite him into the household of one's concern. The Stoics took the matter of address with great seriousness. The terms by which we name our relations are not neutral instruments. They are the means by which we either expand or contract the warmth we extend. And then it means to act as one would act toward a brother, to inquire after his health, to attend his celebrations and his griefs, to lend without expectation of immediate return, to forgive small offenses without keeping account. The list is unremarkable. The Stoic project of contraction is not a project of grand gestures. It is a project of small, repeated, deliberate adjustments in the daily conduct of relations. Move outward again to the circle of fellow citizens, and the work becomes harder still. There is no natural warmth here at all. The fellow citizen is, for most practical purposes, a stranger. He shares your laws, your civic festivals, your obligations to defend the walls, but he is not your kin. To draw him inward, Hierocles would say, is to remind yourself, repeatedly and against the natural slackening of attention, that he is a man who stands in the same relation to his own circles as you stand to yours. He has a mother, he has children, he has fears and hopes that if he could articulate them, would sound very like your own. The figure of the circles is reflexive. To draw a man inward in your own diagram is to recognize that you stand in his diagram somewhere as well. You are someone's outer circle. The drawing inward is mutual, or it is incomplete. Move outward once more to the circle of those who dwell in neighboring towns, of those of the same nation, of those who share the species. Here, the work becomes almost entirely a work of reason, against the resistance of imagination. The man in the next town you may meet at a market. The man in the next province you may never meet. the man across the sea you will certainly never meet. And yet, Hierocles insists the work of contraction extends to him as well. This is the cosmopolitan claim, and we must be precise about what it is and is not. Hierocles is not telling you to feel for the distant stranger what you feel for your own child. He knows this is impossible. He is telling you to act where action is possible, in recognition of the kinship that reason discloses. He is telling you not to harm. He is telling you to render aid where occasion arises. He is telling you to refuse the doctrines that would persuade you that the foreigner is less than human, that the slave is by nature a slave, that the barbarian deserves what is done to him. The Stoic cosmopolitan does not abolish distance. He refuses, however, to let distance become a license. Here we must pause and acknowledge the difficulty that has been sitting in the room since we began. Hierocles wrote within a slave-holding society. His students would, many of them, have owned slaves. His doctrine of the kinship of all human beings did not produce, in him or in those he taught, the conclusion that slavery was incompatible with the doctrine. The Stoics, as a school, criticized cruelty to slaves, urged that they be treated as human beings, insisted that the inner freedom of the wise man could not be touched by any external condition, including bondage. They did not, in the main, call for the abolition of the institution. We can name this without litigating it for the length of an episode. The principle Hierocles articulates is more radical than the application he made of it. The figure of the circles, drawn carefully and followed to its conclusions, presses against the structures of the world that produced it. It is the nature of certain philosophical claims to outrun the lives of those who first made them. We are not required, in receiving the figure, to receive also the limits of its first reception. We are required only to ask whether the figure itself is true, and whether the work it asks of us is work we can begin to do. So let us now state plainly what Hierocles is teaching. The structural lesson of the circles is this. The first lesson is descriptive. You are a creature of concentric attention. Your concern for what is near is greater than your concern for what is far. And this is not a fault in you, but a fact about you. Nature has built you in this way for reasons of preservation. The infant who attended equally to its own foot and to a stranger's foot would not survive infancy. The adult who attended equally to her own child and to a child she has never met would not be able to function as a parent. The graduated structure of concern is not a moral failing. It is the condition within which moral life takes place. The second lesson is normative. The graduated structure, though natural, is not fixed. It can be worked upon. The circles can be drawn inward, and the work of drawing them inward is the work of ethics. This work is not done by exhortation. It is not done by suddenly attempting to love the stranger as your own child. It is done by the patient, daily, incremental practice of treating those in the further circles as though they stood somewhat closer than the natural slackening of attention would place them. The cousin somewhat more like a brother, the neighbor somewhat more like a kinsman, the fellow citizen somewhat more like a neighbor, the foreigner somewhat more like a fellow citizen. The work proceeds by degrees, and the degrees matter. The third lesson is the lesson about the self. Notice that the figure begins with the self at the center, but the self at the center is not the goal of the figure. The self at the center is the starting point, and the direction of the work is outward, even as the means of the work is the inward contraction of the outer rings. There is a paradox here that the Stoic tradition meant for us to feel. The self is established in the doctrine of Oikeiōsis only to be enlarged. The household of your concern, which begins as the small circle containing your body, is meant to grow until it contains the species. And the self that has done this work, the self that has drawn the outer rings inward through long practice, is no longer the small self with which it began. It is a self whose center has, in a sense, moved. The fourth lesson is the lesson about reason. The work of contraction is the work of reason against the resistance of imagination and habit. Imagination falters at distance. Habit settles into familiar patterns of warmth and coldness. Reason is what discloses to you that the man you have never met stands in the same relation to his circles as you stand to yours, and reason is what asks you to act in accordance with this disclosure, even when feeling has not caught up. The Stoics did not despise feeling. They simply observed that feeling is not by itself capable of expanding to the size of the species. Reason is what extends the work past the point where feeling can carry it. The fifth lesson, and the one most easily missed, is the lesson about completeness. Hierocles does not promise that the work can be finished. The figure has no outer boundary at which the contraction is complete. The species itself is not the final circle, for the Stoics believed there were further circles still. The circle of all rational beings, the circle of the cosmos, understood as a single living thing. The work of Oikeiōsis is the work of a life, and a life is not long enough to complete it. What the figure offers is not an end state, but a direction. You will die having drawn some of the circles inward, and many will remain in their natural places, and this is the human condition. The principle is not violated by incompletion. The principle is honored by the direction of the work. We come now to the closing of the lesson. The teacher has set down his stylus. The wax tablet still bears the figure he drew. The students are quiet. He says one more thing, and then the session ends. He says, "Look at the figure tonight when you are alone. Find yourself at the center. Trace the circles outward. Name in your mind the people who stand in each circle. Then ask yourself of each circle whether you have treated those within it as the doctrine asks, not whether you have loved them as you love yourself, for that is not what the doctrine asks, but whether you have drawn them by some measurable degree inward from where natural slackening would have left them. Whether the cousin is, in some small way, more brother to you than he was a year ago. Whether the neighbor is, in some small way, more kinsman. Whether the stranger is, in some small way, more neighbor. And then ask the harder question. Ask in which direction your circles have been moving. Whether the work of your life, taken as a whole, has been the work of drawing the rings inward, or whether some have moved outward, growing colder, losing the warmth they once held. There are friendships that have slackened into acquaintanceship, brothers who have become cousins, cousins who have become strangers. The figure can be drawn the wrong way. The work of contraction has an opposite, and the opposite is also done by small daily acts. This is the question Hierocles leaves you with. Not whether you are a good person, not whether you have lived up to some standard, but simply, in which direction are your circles moving, and by what daily acts is the motion being made? The teacher dismisses the students. They walk out into the late afternoon light of a provincial city in the 2nd century. The figure remains on the tablet. By tomorrow, it will have been smoothed away to make room for the next day's lesson. But the figure does not need the tablet. It is the kind of figure that once seen is not forgotten. You have seen it now. What you do with it is the work of the rest of your life.